श्रीगुरुभ्यो नमः। हरिः ओम्। सदाशिवसमारम्भां शङ्कराचार्यमध्यमाम् अस्मदाचार्यपर्यन्तां वन्दे गुरुपरम्परां। श्रुतिस्मृतिपुराणानामालयं करुणालयं नमामि भगवत्पादशङ्करं लोकशङ्करं। शङ्कारूपेण मच्चित्तं पङ्कीकृतमभूद्यया किङ्करीयस्य सामाया शङ्कराचार्यमाश्रये। प्रह्लादवरदो देवो यो नृसिंहः परो हरिः नृसिंहोपासकं नित्यं तं नृसिंहगुरुं भजे। श्रीसच्चिदानन्दशिवाभिनव्यनृसिंहभारत्यभिधान्यतीन्द्रान् विद्यानिधीन् मन्त्रनिधीन् सदात्मनिष्ठान् भजे मानवशम्भुरूपान्। सदात्मध्याननिरतं वृषगेभ्यः पराङ्मुखं नौमि शास्त्रेषु निष्णातं चन्द्रशेखरभारतीं। विवेकिनं महाप्रज्ञं धैर्योदार्यक्षमानिधिं सदाभिनवपूर्वं तं विद्यातीर्थगुरुं भजे। भारतीकरुणापात्रं भारतीपदभूषणं भारतीपदमारूढं भारतीतीर्थमाश्रये। विद्याविनयसम्पन्नं वीतरागं विवेकिनं वन्दे वेदान्ततत्त्वज्ञं विदुशेखरभारतीम्। It's once again with great pleasure that we meet today on the auspicious occasion of Adi Shankara Bhagavatpada's Jayanti celebrations, and in this context we are doing the text called Atma Bodha, and we had covered nearly 60 verses over the last 2 years, and we hope to complete the entire work on the occasion of Adi Shankara Bhagavatpada's Jayanti. And in the last session, we had looked at verse number 61. Yadbhasa bhasa bhasyaterkadi bhasyeryatuna bhasyate yena sarvamidam bhati tadbrahmetyavadharayet. So Shankaracharya had invoked the Mundakopanishad mantra, which also occurs in the Kathopanishad. Atatta suryo bhati achandratarakam nema vidyuto bhanti kutoyamagnihi tameva bhantam anubhati sarvam tasya bhasa sarvamidam vibhati. Even though there are many sources of light, like the sun, the stars, fire and lightning, etc., they do not have the capacity to illuminate the Atma, because the Atma is Svaprakasha. Just like you cannot use a candle to illuminate the sun, the even great celestial light sources like the sun, stars, etc., do not have the capacity to illuminate Atma Chaitanya, the self-consciousness. And the reason for that is Atma Chaitanyam is Svaprakasham. It is self-luminous. It does not expect any other source to illuminate it. It shines forth by itself. So, rather than the sun and the stars illuminating it, it is in fact the self which illuminates the sun and the stars. Because if in the absence of the self, the sun and the stars cannot be known. Their light will not shine. And therefore, Shankaracharya, by invoking the Shruti mantra, says Yadbhasa bhasyaterkadi, sun, etc., shine because of the illumination of the self. Bhasyair yastuna bhasyate. But that Atma is not illuminated by the light, other sources of light, the worldly sources of light. Yena sarvamidam bhati tad brahmetyavadharayet. No Brahman to be that which, because of which everything shines, in whose light everything else shines. Know that to be Brahman. Avadharayet. Understand this clearly, Shankaracharya says. And Shankaracharya will keep using the word Avadharayet, Veda, etc., meaning know this. Because, as we all saw in the earlier sessions of Atma Bodha, Shankaracharya had established that Jnana Devata Kaivalyam, Moksha or Kaivalyam, is only possible through Jnana, through knowledge, and not through anything else. And therefore he says, Tat Brahmetyavadharayet. Know this truth clearly, and if you know it, you would have attained liberation. So that was, we had seen this verse in the last session. We will look at the next verse, verse number 62. स्वयं अंतर्बहिर्व्याप्य भासयन् अखिलं जगत् ब्रह्म प्रकाशते वह्नि प्रतप्ताय स पिण्डवत्. So, so Shankaracharya in the previous verse had said that Brahman is Jyotisham Jyotihi. It is the light of all lights. That is actually it is reminiscent of a Shruti Vakya. The previous verse was reminiscent of the Shruti Vakya Jyotisham Jyotihi. That this is the light source which illuminates all light sources. And after saying that, Shankaracharya says the illumination is not just external illumination, it's also an internal illumination also. And what do we mean by internal? Internal and external are only with respect to the physical body. And so, within the physical body, the mind is present and the sense organs are present. And the mind and the senses are illumined by the Atma, but the Atma is not illumined by the mind and senses. Similarly, the world is illumined by the Atma, but the Atma is not illumined by the world. Just like any object becomes visible when it is pervaded by light, an object becomes known when it is pervaded by consciousness. And so he says, Swayam antar bahir vyapya bhasayan akhilam jagate. Antar bahir vyapya. Pervading inside and outside. Swayam bhasayan. And shining by itself, it illuminates the entire universe. And what Shankaracharya is trying to compare this with, he's saying to the common man, it appears as though the mind and senses are themselves conscious. There is a erroneous notion that the mind and the senses are conscious. And that's why we say things like, there's a very famous philosopher, René Descartes, who said, I think, therefore I am. So he takes the fact of him being conscious of his thought, and he concludes that he exists because he thinks. Whereas Vedanta says you are, and the reason why you are is because you are self-luminous. And you here does not refer to the mind. So when Shankaracharya said, when René Descartes says, I think, he is making the classic error of conflating, of mixing up the Atma with the mind. And so he says, I think, and therefore I am. In fact, what we in Vedanta would say, I am, therefore the mind thinks. The capacity of the mind to think, the capacity of the mind to know, is because the light that I am pervading upon that mind. And to illustrate that point, Shankaracharya uses the example. As we had seen in the Atma Bodha, this entire text you'll have lots of illustrations to better explain points that are particularly tricky. So, how can you understand that the mind is actually inert and there is some other source that actually illuminates it? And so, the illustration given here is that of a bright red ball, iron ball. And I don't know how many would have seen, but if you go to a blacksmith and if he's heating this iron ball and it becomes red hot, so to speak. Actually, what is burning, what is shining there, it's not the iron itself. The iron is simply the medium for the manifestation of fire. What is actually burning? If you touch that iron ball, it will be hot to touch, and you can see the iron ball and it looks like a red ball. But it is not the iron that is hot or the iron that is bright red. Rather, it is the fire element that has pervaded that iron ball. Similarly, the mind appears to be active, the mind appears to think, but it is not the mind that is thinking, it is not the mind that is active, rather, it is consciousness shining upon the mind that makes you think that the mind is the one that is thinking and therefore the one that is knowing. The problem comes is because just like we think that the iron ball is red hot, when it's actually the fire that is red hot and the iron is simply a manifestation for the heat and light of that fire. Similarly, the mind is not conscious, the mind is actually inert. It is consciousness that has pervaded the mind, antar bahir vyapya, that makes both the world shine and the mind shine. So, this idea is reinforcing the adhyasa or the superimposition of the notion of I upon the body and the mind. And the reason for the superimposition of the notion of I, the self, upon the body, that is, you take the body and the mind to be the self, is because the shining of the consciousness lends life, imparts life, as it were, to the body and the mind. The body and the mind are, in fact, merely inert entities, but they act as though they have their own consciousness, but in fact, it is an external source that is making them conscious. Just like a mirror reflects the light and appears as though it is as bright as the sun, in reality, it is only the sun that is bright and the mirror is merely reflecting. The mind appears to be the knower, the mind appears to act, the mind appears conscious, the mind appears to be me, myself, when in fact it is the Atma that is shining on the mind. It is because of the Atma that the mind shines. Okay. Now we will look at the next verse, verse number 63. Jagad vilakshanam brahma brahmanonyanna kinchana brahmanyad bhati chen mithya yatha marumarichika. So in this verse, Shankaracharya is saying there is a difference between Brahman and the world. So Brahman is distinct from the world, but there is nothing other than Brahman. So how can that be possible? So if you say A is different from B, then you ought to also say B is different from A. How can you say A is different from B and there is no B at all? Apart from A, there is nothing. Under what conditions will that be true? Shankaracharya says it will be true if the second entity is an unreal entity. So, Brahman, the reality, is different from the unreal world. But if you separate Brahman from the unreal world, there is nothing else. And this is the essence of the Purnamadav Purnamidam mantra. So there it says Purnamadav Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate. So that's the mantra, no? So what it says is this world is actually Purnam. This world is nothing but Brahman itself. That Brahman is also Purnam, infinite. When you take the world outside of Brahman, that is, if you withdraw consciousness from the world, what remains is consciousness only. That means the world has an existence because it is consciousness that is giving it that existence. And that is why Purnam Idam, this world is Purnam because there is a Purna Tattva that is giving consciousness, Purnatvam to this. And once you take Purnasya Purnamadaya, if you take out the infinite Brahman from the Purna world, What remains is Purna only, infinite only. That means there is no world in reality, it is only Brahman that is giving it reality. So to make it even simpler, if you have a clay pot, the existence of that pot is the clay only. The substance of the pot is clay. Now, if you say, let me take out the clay from the clay pot, what remains? Nothing remains. If you take out the clay from the clay pot, there is no thing called pot. Similarly, you have Brahman and the world. Now, because this world is mithya, is unreal, Brahman is distinct from the world. However, there is nothing which is distinct from Brahman, because there is no other thing other than Brahman. So this is the idea that is being conveyed in this particular verse. So the nature of Advaita is being explained by Shankaracharya. Essentially, the idea that is being said here is that Brahman is never experienced as a separate entity. So everything appears within consciousness, but consciousness does not appear by itself. Just like the fire needs a medium for it to shine, that is, it needs that iron ball, and so but we confuse the iron ball as though it is red, when in fact it is the fire that is red. If you take out the iron ball, can the fire be manifest? No. So the manifestation of consciousness requires the body, the mind, and the world. But therefore, the Brahman can never be known separately or independently. It always requires the presence of something. Now, this naturally leads to a doubt whether there are two entities, Brahman and the universe. So this is the philosophy of the Sankhyas. So the Sankhya philosopher says that there are two realities. There is Prakriti and there is Purusha. Both of them are equally real. Prakriti is nature, is the world. Purusha is the consciousness principle. And for them, the Sankhyas, Purusha and Prakriti are equally real. Matter and spirit is equally real. They also agree with the Advaitins that apart from Prakriti, apart from matter, there is something distinct. Jagat Vilakshanam, there is a distinct entity called consciousness, called Purusha. And where they differ from Advaita is, we say that if you take out the Purusha from the Prakriti, there is no Prakriti at all. So like the Sankhya philosophers, we also agree that there is a consciousness that is separate from matter. Where we disagree is that we then go on to say there is no matter different from consciousness. Everything that appears is matter, and matter is mithya. It is an appearance with no intrinsic reality. And the reality that underpins that appearance belongs to consciousness. Now, consciousness becomes manifest because of that mithya entity, but that mithya entity has no reality independent of consciousness. And therefore, all that exists is consciousness and consciousness alone. And that is Advaita. And the example given here is Yatha Marumarichika. So Marumarichika means a mirage. So if you are going in a very hot summer's day, and if you're traveling on a long road journey, you can see that in the distance, that a road itself will appear as though there is water on it. That is only a mirage water. It is not a real water. The water has an appearance that you cannot deny, but that appearance has no reality. So, in Advaita, mithya is that which appears but does not exist. The difference between us and Dvaitavada is that we say that there are three types, three orders of reality. So there is Sat, that which is absolutely existent. and there is only one absolute existence, that is Brahman. Then there is Asat, which absolutely does not exist, and it doesn't even appear to exist anywhere. These are completely fictitious things like the hare's horn, Shashasringam. See, a cow will have horn, a goat will have horns, but a hare, a rabbit will not have horns. So the Shashasringam, horns of a hare, is only a verbal construct. There is no reality that corresponds to that. Look, there is no point in time, there is no place where one will see a hare's horn. So that is Asat. So there is Sat, which is Brahman, there is Asat, which is the hare's horn, and then there's a third type of reality called Mithya. It appears, but it is not real, like Marumarichika. That means it appears, but just like the mirage water appears, it has an appearance, but there is no underlying reality to that. That is, there is no real water there, it is only the hot road that appears like the water. There is no reality to that water itself. So there is appearance but no reality. That is the third thing. So there is Sat, Asat, and then there is Satasat Vilakshanam. That which is different from the Sat and different from the Asat. Sat is that which can never be denied, whose existence can never not be in any period of time. Asat is that which can never exist in any point of time. And then there is Mithya, which doesn't exist in the very locus of its appearance. So just like the mirage water doesn't exist despite appearing, the world doesn't exist despite appearing. And that's what Shankaracharya says, Jagat Vilakshanam Brahma. So in Advaita, in order to teach about Brahman, there is a particular krama or sequence. First, the teacher establishes that there is an entity that is distinct from the world called Brahman. And then once the Brahman has been distinctly identified, then the teaching is there is no such thing called the world. And all that exists is Brahman only. This is called Adhyaropa Apavada. That is, it is a superimposition. The teaching itself will superimpose something, and the teaching itself will then negate what it has superimposed. And the purpose of it is to convey the underlying reality. And that is why there is a very ancient verse, Adhyaropa Apavadabhyam Nishprapancham Prapanchate. So the mode with which the Shruti teaches about Brahman is by the prakriya or teaching methodology of Adhyaropa Apavada, of superimposition. So first the Shruti will say this entire world that is a matter of perception has a creator who has created this world. He is the person that has created the world. He is the one that sustains the world, and he is the one that destroys, annihilates the world and resolves the world into himself. And each of these three functions are then split into three forms of the creator. Brahma as the creator, Mahavishnu as the sustainer, and Ishvara, Paramashiva as the annihilator. However, in reality, then the teaching will go on to say, this world which has been created by this Ishvara who has three forms, in reality does not exist, is Mithya. That is this next level of teaching. So the first is Adhyaropa, and then there is Apavada. So if the world is not real, then creation itself is not real. If creation is not real, then creation is not a real function of that Brahman that has been taught to be the creator. So this third step is, having denied the reality of the world, creation itself is denied. So the teaching is, this world has a creator. The next is, the world is Mithya. The third is, there is no creation. And therefore, what remains at the end of that teaching is the Ajata Brahma. Brahma in which there is no creation at all. It's Ajativada. And this is the Ajativada of the Upanishads, which Adi Shankara Bhagavad Pada's Parama Guru Gaudapada Acharya taught in the Mandukya Karikas. So, Ajativada is not a theory that Gaudapada has propounded. Some people say that Gaudapada's Ajativada. No, it is actually the Upanishad's Ajativada. And therefore, there is a very famous verse which talks about this Adhyaropa Apavadabhyam Nishprapancham Prapanchate. So, the first step of that is to say there is something distinct from the world called Brahman. And that's what Shankaracharya is hinting at here, that very deep, profound idea Shankaracharya conveys in a very simple verse. Jagat Vilakshanam Brahma. That's the first step. There is a Brahman which is distinct from the world. And then it says, Brahmanonyanna kinchana. Brahmanaha anyate na kinchana asti. There is nothing apart from Brahman. If anything appears apart from Brahman, Brahmanyat bhati chet, if there is anything that appears apart from Brahman, mithya eva, that is mithya alone. Like what? Yatha marumarichika. Like the mirage one. Okay. I think with that we have covered this particular verse, and then we can take the next verse. Drishyate shruyate yatyat brahmano nyanna tad bhavet tattvajnanacha tad brahma satchidanandamadvayam. So, there is only one entity. There is only one undivided consciousness. However, due to ignorance, that undivided consciousness is mistaken because of the multiplicities in the world. So we think that the world consisting of so many different things is the reality, and we forget the underlying one true reality behind it. Just like the same rope is seen by the wise man as a rope and by the ignorant man as the snake, the reality that there is only one object, Brahman, is known by the wise man, but by the ignorant man, he sees it to be the world. So, as we said here, the first stage of the teaching is to separate Brahman from the known universe. Because, and the reason for that is, so why is the Adhyaropa Apavada Prakriya adopted? The reason is because the teaching is so subtle. Brahman is, as we said, it's Asthula, Mananu, Ahrasvam, Adirgham, etc. in the last session. And the reason for that, it is attributeless. There is no guna by which you can describe it. And therefore, it is quite subtle. It's a very difficult idea to understand and to grasp. And because it is intertwined with the universe, there is an anyonya adhyasa. There is a mutual superimposition between Brahman and the world. So to the ignorant with no exposure to the Veda, the world alone is real. There is no entity called Brahman for such an individual. So therefore the first step of the teaching is to introduce Brahman as the reality that is the creator, sustainer, and ultimately the destroyer of the world. And then once that idea of Brahman has taken hold, the same scripture will go on to say that the world is merely an appearance in the Brahman. The reality is Brahman, the world is Mithya. And the final teaching is that therefore there are no two entities called the world and Brahman. Rather, it is Brahman alone that exists. And that's what Shankaracharya is saying. Drishyate shruyate yatyate. Whatever is seen, whatever is heard, is not distinct from Brahman. There is no thing there which is heard or seen other than Brahman only. Brahmanaha anyatna bhavet. And how do you know that? Tattvajnanacha tad Brahma. Upon the rise of right knowledge, we realize that it is the world alone that is only an appearance, and the underlying reality is Brahman. It is Brahman alone which appears as the world. We forget the appearance and we look at the true reality behind that. And what is the true reality? It's Satchidananda Madvayam. It is Sat, it is existence, it is Chit, consciousness, It is Ananda, bliss, and it is non-dual. There is nothing apart from that Satchidananda Brahma, is the message that is being conveyed here. And so there is one more verse we will look at, and then we will bring this to a session to a close, and then we will conclude the entire Atma Bodha in the next session. So verse number 65. Sarvagam Satchidatmanam Jnana Chakshur Nirikshate Ajnana Chakshur Neksheta Bhasvantam Bhanumandhavat. Okay. The dual viewpoints of the wise man and the ignorant man are illustrated in this verse. So here it says that the one with the Jnana Chakshu, the one who is endowed with the eye of wisdom, correctly perceives the all-pervading Atma, the Satchidananda Atma. Jnana Chakshuhu Nirikshate Sarvagam Satchidatmanam. The one endowed with the eye of wisdom correctly perceives the all-pervading self, which is Sat, Chit and Atma, whereas Ajnana Chakshuhu Neksheta. Whereas the one who does not have the eye of wisdom, whose eyes are blindfolded by ignorance, by Ajnana, such a person is called an Ajnana Chakshu. He who is blindfolded in the darkness that is ignorance, he does not see Brahman, he only sees the world. And Shankaracharya says the situation of the ignorant man is like he says Bhasvantam Bhanum Andhavat. The ignorant man is like the blind person who, in the middle of the afternoon, in the blazing sunshine, he is not able to perceive the glorious shining sun. Even though it is burning so brightly, he is not able to see it. Why? Because he lacks the chakshu, the jnana chakshu. The blind man lacks the pramana, the means with which to see the blazing sun, whereas a person with eyes has the pramana to see the sun. He can perceive the sun, he can see it. Similarly, the ajnana chakshu, he is not endowed with the shastra pramana. He is not endowed with the mahavakya pramana through which one realizes the true nature of the Atma as Brahman, and because of which he misses Brahman even though it is shining in every single thought. In every single object it is Brahman that is shining. Just like the blazing sun at noon time, all that appears is Brahman only. It is the shiningness in every thought. Vyavrittasu anuvartamanam aham ityanta spurantam sada, as Shankaracharya had said in the Dakshinamurti Stotram. In the changing world, in the changing mind, in the changing senses, there is, in the changing states, balyadishu jagradadishu tatha sarvasvasthasvapi. In all the changing states, from childhood to youth, to middle age, old age, death, balyadishu jagradadishu tatha. In all states of waking, dreaming, and sleeping, in all the changing states, Vyavrittasu means in all these changing states, there is one unchanging reality. What is that? Aham. Vyavrittasu anuvartamanam aham iti antaspurantam sada. We mistake that shining Atma and we mistake that for the small I, the little ego that is appearing in this one mind. We mistake that for the true reality. But the real nature, it's like it is shining always and in everything. Pratibodha viditam matam. In every thought, it is Brahman alone that shines. In every object, It is Brahman alone that shines as Sat, as existence. The existence of anything is actually Brahman. So, despite the blazing noon sun that is Brahman, we, the Ajnana Chakshu, miss it and we see something else instead. We see the world. And that is the tragedy that is there for us. But thankfully, we have the Jagat Guru, that is Adi Shankara Bhagavad, who is leading us from darkness to light, from tamas to jyoti, tamasoma jyotirgamaya. So with those words and ideas, let us bring this particular session to a conclusion, and we will take up the concluding verses of Atma Bodha in the next session. Purnamadah Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.